This is a way to map the EPAs from years 1 to 4, in our curriculum, but for you, you may be mapping them from years 1 to 6, or from years, at the very least, certainly from years 5 and 6. But I would have you think about, can you even start them earlier? And for us, when we introduced more clinical application, it really made the students pay much more attention to the basic science, because they could see why they were learning the information. It made much more sense to them. Learning hypercalcemia on its own is interesting, but when they actually could see a patient with that problem, much easier to remember that information. So a little bit on learning research, mastery short-term versus long-term, and we all know, when we were all students, we crammed for exams. How much did you really remember? You forced yourself to memorize, but how much was really long-term memory? And we know from learning research that deep learning really requires constant reinforcement, and not just repetition, but it has to be attached to something. So this is where, the example of hypercalcemia attached to a patient case, seen in multiple different ways, designing a series. If we decide that hypercalcemia is a must learn, then we need to design a series with what's called spaced repetition, often used in language, and also attach it to experience and context. And here, I added a little saying, I hear, I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand, which was attributed to Confucius, but Dr. Lyon, his ever very mindful research, found the true author. And Dr. Lyon, do you want to tell us who that is?
可能晚上睡不着觉，所以我常常在美国都看到这个句子，我不太相信这个是孔子讲的，所以上去查了一下，是荀子讲的。闻之不如不闻，不闻不如闻之，一直下去。
But the problem is in English, everyone only knows Confucius. So anything that sounds profound, we just say it was from Confucius. Yeah. So for adaptive learning, and I'm almost finished here, I just want to mention that more and more of our education is actually using computer-based methods where things like, medicine is so filled with facts. There's a lot of vocabulary that must be memorized. There's no getting around it. I mean, there's so many terms, so many concepts that need to be learned. There's a certain amount that has to be memorized. But we do know from brain research, learning theory, etc., that the more paths we have, the more activities we have, different neural pathways to master something, is really key. And so as we start using more online learning, we're able to incorporate reading, listening, hearing, doing, the virtual reality technology is coming along very quickly with the haptic technology for surgery, surgical techniques, and the fact that we learn through stories. So, using these multiple methods of adaptive learning are going to be critical. And with this slide, I just want to remind us that as we teach, we're constantly assessing the learner, but then that feedback needs to come back to us to revise our teaching. it's this constant cycle. You know, it's not just us teaching and assessing the student. We have to remember that we are constantly needing to revise our methods, to collecting the data and using that data to improve our teaching. So I know that Dr. Lai and many of his colleagues have pushed accreditation for Taiwan. You know, you're ahead of many countries in doing so. As you change your curricula, as you evolve the way you do your training, I would really urge you to keep your longitudinal data and make those comparisons across schools. And that's where the accreditation bodies are really helpful. So for us, the AAMC, Association of American Medical Colleges, and LCMER accreditation, those data, the aggregate national data, are actually fed back to all the schools. And that's really important data for us to continually compare ourselves to other institutions. And helps us decide where to invest our energies, what kinds of educational interventions are most effective, and most importantly, tracking, does it make a difference in patient care? And this last one's very tough to do, but you know, we're constantly looking at ways of being able to do a better job of that. So this is what I call a holistic approach to curriculum assessment, gathering your assessment data, tying that assessment both with your clinical practice and your research, developing CQI. How many of you are familiar with continuous quality improvement? You know, this is something that is very much emphasized in the U.S. hospitals, and more we're tying training continuous improvement with hospital-based and clinic-based continuous improvement practices. It's all seamless and part of the same holistic system. So, you know, in summary, you know, it's really, we're focusing on training for independent practice. We want our students and residents really to have the knowledge, skills, and attitudes and performance for them to increasingly take more and more responsibility and autonomy with those core EPAs, because we want them to be competent and provide excellent patient care when no one is looking. You know, you're supervising them very closely, but there's a point when no one is looking at, you know, when they're out in practice. So hopefully over this past session, we've talked about how we assess, why we assess, what the various definitions of competencies and EPAs are, thinking about how formative assessment and learning research can aid students, and thinking about how you might integrate further your work on clinical education, assessment, and research. And with that, I leave you with, and Dr. Lai, you're going to check on this one too, right? And see whether this one's right. I think it is, but you know, again, it's translated from the Greek. So we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So this is something I think that's important for students to think about, but also for us as faculty and institutions of training, that unless we're pushing excellence every day and making a habit for all of us, you know, this is, you know, we're really aspiring to this level of excellence. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks for Professor Lee's excellent talk. We got a couple minutes. We can get some questions.
your experience, when you make a transition from traditional teaching to competence-based teaching, and you need more staff, or does the staff time need more time? Staff number and the time of the teacher.
Yes, that's an excellent question. You know, whether when you make a transition to this kind of training, you definitely need faculty development. Our faculty say they don't have any more time to teach, so we have to make teaching more efficient. And so that's why I mentioned the multiple different methods, you know, the students teaching each other, there are things online, you know, etc. So what we've moved to is something where we have a small core of medical educator faculty. So clinicians, practicing clinicians, who are very interested in medical education. And it's a small group, I'd say maybe 20 or 30 faculty who are intensively into medical education, who've done a lot of the planning and training and development. And then we create these much more simplified training modules for clinical faculty. So we know that we can't get clinical faculty out. For us, our clinical faculty are all over New England. And some of our sites are hours away by car. So they cannot come to us to be trained. We go to them. So we will do these training sessions, but they have to be short because they don't have time. So we create the faculty development in short modules. So the example I gave in year one, where our students are going out to those clinics. So we trained our students to prepare to go into the clinic through 6 two-hour workshops. So our students had 12 hours of training before they even stepped into a clinic, because we wanted to make sure that they would be helpful and not drive the clinicians crazy and say, don't come back again. But on the clinician side, we had to give them also a little bit of training because many of them had never had a medical student in their office. And so we devised, with help from some of the clinicians, we did some focus groups to say what would be most helpful to you. And then we made very short training modules for those clinical faculty to prepare them to take the students, because we needed those clinical faculty to be able to assess the students more accurately. And if you remember from Dr. Saku's talk, he was saying that in their OSCEs they had a hospital-based observer and another observer from the community, and how different they were. And so our goal is that if we provide sufficient training, they should be the same or very close. And so we've gotten better at it. It's not perfect, but we need that consistency because we have 200 students per class, and we have almost no attrition. So we graduate essentially the same 200. And so that's a lot of students, which means a lot of faculty that we need in the community helping us train. But we have to prove to our accrediting body that if a student goes to that clinic in Maine, 2 states over, and at our major teaching hospital, we have to prove to them it's the same training. And the only way we can do that is through very specific competencies, training the faculty to assess them the same way. And we gather all the data and show that no matter where they train, they pass the national board exams, they perform, our students rotate through all different hospitals across New England. And so we have to show that all of those experiences are comparable. Another question?
like we know America is in a leading class in like many fields, including the medicine. So I would like to ask, what would you say is the main reason that leads to this kind of advantage, like from a medical education aspect, that leads to, is it systematic? Is it about the course or financially or something?
That's a great question. I really have seen a lot of the changes happen over the last 30 years, and there's no one single thing. I think we were fortunate to have visionary education leaders at the national level, because it doesn't just happen at a school. I was mentioning that a lot of the schools are changing because they're forced to change because of accreditation. But if the accrediting body didn't pay attention, if they didn't change the requirements, then those changes would not be pushed. And there were many educators who were pushing from individual medical schools before accreditation changed. So for instance, we started using simulated patients back in the 1980s. And we were among, University of Massachusetts actually was one of the leaders, and because they were in Massachusetts, Tufts became one of their partner schools in testing simulation, standardized patients. And that was probably 15 years ahead of the accrediting bodies. So, it's a mixture of innovative faculty creating new methods and saying we need to change. We get these incredibly bright students. How can we help them be the best doctors they can? And we know that we have such a huge responsibility for their training, and how can we make it better? And so I think it's a combination of people at schools making innovative changes, and those people get onto the boards of our accrediting bodies and help push change. They get onto the national board exams, and the board exam itself has changed tremendously. I'd say over the last, I guess it's also about 15 years, that our national boards changed completely to clinically based board exams. Way back when I took the board, first part of the boards was all basic science, before you then moved into parts 2 and 3, which were clinical. Now even part 1 is all clinical. You need to know basic science, but everything is seen through the lens of clinical medicine. And that was really clinical faculty pushing that agenda at the national level, because they said, wait a minute, we're turning, the majority of students going through medical school are training to be practicing physicians, not researchers. And we need the emphasis to be on clinical medicine. So, I think it was just many, many different forces coming together to make those changes.
Thank you. Those are the timing. Professor, come up to the stage. We have the organized committee and the additional medics for something.
Thank you very much for the brilliant speech. Next program will be moderated by Director of Nuclear Medicine, Professor Zhen Chenyi. May I invite Professor Zhen Chenyi to come up on stage?
Thank you. President Stu and Professor Lai and Professor Lee, Professor Zhang, and all our distinguished guests. Because I am the rescue for the job. Because Professor Liu informed me that he got a heavy common cold and his fever never just sustained, so he cannot go north to this conference. So before I introduce Professor Akita, I would like to say something. Because all of you and most of you, I think is the faculty, and we have many pressures. And one of the most pressure in Taiwan, I think, is our medical education system is transformed to a 6-year program and from 7 years. So the time to teach is reduction, but the amount and abilities to need to teach are the same or even upsizing. So we need to think about if there are any new teaching modules or teaching trends or teaching methods to teach our students. So that's why we invited Professor Akita to give our next talk, Trends in Anatomy, Teaching for Clinical Education. So let me introduce Professor Akita. Akita is currently the president of Japanese Research Society of Clinical Anatomists. He also is the professor and head of Department of Clinical Anatomy, Tokyo Medical and Dental University. Professor Akita was born in Sapporo, Hokkaido, where most of the Taiwanese are very familiar with the very hot spot of Japan. And in 1962, and was grown and in the same place. After graduation of university, he studied and worked in Tokyo. His major research field is clinical anatomy. From October 1993 to September 1995, Professor Akita was a research fellow at Department of Anatomy, Developmental Biology, University College, London, and studied experimental biology by using chip embryos. On 2012, Professor Akita established the Asia Association of Clinical Anatomy with Asian colleagues. From 2013, he took over the Japanese Research Society of Clinical Anatomists. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big hand to welcome Professor Akita to the next talk.
Thank you very much. So before my talk, I'd like to introduce our curriculums. So I made these slides 1 hour ago, so most of the Japanese, I'm sorry about that. So now we have 6 years curriculums. And this is the grade 1, and this is the 6 years. So, and at that time, in the first year, so this is the liberal arts year. So, and the second year, the basic science year, and third year, clinical science lecture year. In the fourth year, we have the project semester. The project semester is a half an year free time to study in a basic research institute or the department. And then there are no lecture and no duties in a half a year. So after that, they finish the project. so they moved to the clinical clerkship. So and in this year, after 3 months later, from the project semester, they got the CBT and OSCE that Professor Saku introduced. And 1.5 years, so we had the clinical clerkship and the final exam and the national exam. That is the 6 years program. So important point is our curriculum is our school policy is to make the good clinicians, and another policy is to make a good researcher. So we focus the basic science. So in the 3 months, in the first 3 months and the 3.5 months, we teach the anatomy and the histology and the physiology, the pharmacology, and so on. So the next one is the biochemistry and so on, and the neurosciences, and the immunology and the infectious disease, and social medicine. So we made such a basic science modules that we focused in the same kind of the subject in the same time, and it's very focused. And then the clinical science lecture seasons, we made just 2 weeks or 3 weeks in a very focused block. And for example, this is a gastrointestinal block, and this is a respiratory disease block, and so on. So we just focused the 3 weeks and 4 weeks and 2 weeks. So every last day of the block, so we had the term exam and basically TBL side, team-based learning. So that is our curriculums. So very simple and very focused in the basic science. So I just talked my different change to. So I start my talk. So I'm the professor of the clinical. I'm professor of the clinical anatomy. So my researches of my department are mainly based on the macroscopic examinations of anatomy. So it is very unfortunate and that medical and dental schools, which are department like our department, have become very few in Japan, also in other countries. Therefore, my department could be regarded as the endangered species. However, advantageously and fortunately, we are asked to collaborate with many departments of surgery, radiology in Japan, from north to south and from east to west, and studying with many PhD students. So my PhD student is now 23 or 24. So many PhD students want to study the macroscopic anatomy. I'm also a president of the Japanese Research Society of Clinical Anatomy. This research society was established almost 20 years ago. 3 doctors were the founders of our society. At first, a surgeon asked the anatomist to solve questions from bedside. Most of members of the society were surgeons and radiologists, and very few anatomists. The topic of our meetings are almost all about the anatomical sciences related to the clinical sciences, and the pure anatomical topics are very rare. There are many societies and associations of clinical anatomy all over the world. Most of members of these societies are working in the anatomy department. In this meaning, Japan is very special situation. 4 years ago, we established the Asian Association of Clinical Anatomy, ASACA, to share the information and cultivate our friendship in Asia. They are interested in anatomy education, especially in recent years, how to teach anatomy efficiently. So anatomy is a real base of clinical sciences. However, in the tight curricula of medical schools, it is very hard to realize the necessary and sufficient education. Many colleagues have made lots of efforts of development of teaching methods. There have been many presentations in many meetings about anatomy education. And today I will talk about the Japanese history of efforts of anatomy education and recent confusions. In addition, I'd like to introduce some researches of new teaching methods in anatomy presented in American Association of Clinical Anatomists this year. So my talk contains 5 main topics. One is the history of anatomy education in Japan. I will show its special nature and its confusions. 2, conflicts between the anatomists and clinicians. In this part, I will discuss about the differences of the way of thinking of anatomy between anatomists and clinicians. And 3, trends in anatomy teaching. In this part, I will introduce recent trends in new teaching methods and the new teaching materials. For evolution in gross anatomy. In this part, I will introduce 3 stories about the problems and confusions in modern textbooks of anatomy. 5, nothing new in anatomy education. So in the last part, I will discuss what should be said in the core points of anatomy education. So let's get started. This is Keiichi Shinsho. Keiichi Shinsho was published in 1774. It looks a half European book and a half Japanese or Chinese book. As you imagine, this was a translated book. This book has an important meaning in Japanese medical education. In addition, publishing this book was the opening of great tragedy in medical education in Japan. The great tragedy means a disadvantage, but this would be good for medicine for Japanese people. Keiichi Shinsho was a translated version of this Dutch book. In those days, Japan had refused to exchange with foreign countries except for China and the Netherlands. Therefore, Kingdom of Netherlands was the only gate for the Western medicine. This book was written in Dutch. However, this book itself was a translated version of German textbook. It is not necessary for you to explain these Chinese letters. This word means a diaphragm. These figures were traced from the original books. It was not necessary for most of students study foreign languages. People who wanted to study Western medicine could get their medical knowledge easily. This book explained the struggling stories and confusion in those days. These stories were written by one of the translators of the Keiichi Shinsho. Therefore, it was told how they translated Dutch into Japanese and what trials and tribulations they had come through. Genpaku Sugita was the author of that book. He published the Japanese version of the textbook, nominated Keiichi Shinsho. I told a little long story of history of translation in Japan, but it is because history of anatomy, especially history of anatomy education, could be very similar to the history of translation of foreign languages into Japanese. Here, I will introduce the complicated stories of students and teachers' efforts and changes in anatomical terminology. There are 3 small bones in the middle ear. These small bones are called as auditory ossicles. The anatomical terms of three bones are the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The malleus means a hammer. The incus means an anvil. This is an iron block with a flat top, and the metallic bar can be hammered and shaped. However, in Japan, the wooden hammers and the wooden block were more popular than the metal hammer and the iron block, and then named them as a wooden hammer and the wooden block. The stapes means the stirrups are attached to the inside of the horse's saddles. So here, I don't want to talk about such small bones. I'd like to talk as one of the very good examples of the problems in Japanese anatomy education. Left column was anatomical terminology published in 1905. Until the end of the 20th century, Latin words were used in anatomy education. Chinese letters were very difficult and complicated. In those years, many medical students could not read aloud these terms. As you know, Japanese language has two kinds of readings in characters. One is the Chinese style reading, the other is the Japanese style reading.